I welcome you to this talk today in our Digital Classicist seminar in Berlin this year. This will be the last talk we will have in this semester, and I'm glad to welcome Mateusz Fafinski here from Free University from Topoi. He had a bachelor degree in classical philology and Mediterranean cultural studies in Poznan at the Adam Mickiewicz University, and then and he made his bachelor degree in 2011, but this didn't hinder him to take part at the University of the Faroe Islands, which I find very interesting, at the Faroe Summer Institute in 2009. Then he continued his studies of medieval studies in the University of Leeds and made his master as well in 2011, as I have seen. Then he came to Berlin in 2011 and he made a master's degree in British studies at the Humboldt University. And with Mateusz Fafinski we have the ideal combination for the theme of his talk, because not only does he have a medieval view on the ancient world, but as well he combines ancient studies and medieval studies. And his talk will therefore be an introduction into his digital assets and components of his project, which is the analysis of medieval charters, as we have seen it here, especially Anglo Saxon charters. And he tries to trace the Roman roads in these medieval charters. I think what I find quite interesting in his abstract is that he doesn't even mention the text encoding initiative, which might not be a point in his techniques or in his technical catalog, and therefore, and as well, he puts very much emphasis in visualization methods of these medieval charters. So I'm very glad to have him here. I'm sorry that we are not that many people, but I think this will intense the discussion afterwards, hopefully. And I give the word over to Mateusz. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. And thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of the Digital Classicist seminar series. And I think my topic fits relatively well, but maybe also to a certain extent stands outside of the main classicist blick into digital humanities. Indeed, what I'm working mostly in my project is looking into how medieval societies used Roman infrastructure in their governance practices. And a very important part of that project takes into account Roman transport infrastructure on the example of Anglo Saxon England. And in order to look into that topic, I am very much working with a set of sources that is namely medieval charters. Essentially, my research works on one big question, and this is: what have the Romans ever done for the Anglo-Saxons? Namely, how did Anglo-Saxon kings and the Anglo-Saxon society use the Roman infrastructure that they have inherited from the time when Britain was the province of the Roman Empire? Of course, one of the main ways of approaching this subject is through archaeology, and archaeology gives us the basis for this research, but also textual sources can give us an insight into that topic. So, what are we going to talk about today? First of all, where can we find out that information in textual sources and especially in the charters? How can we do it? So how can we structure the database to find out what we need? And how can we use text mining? Indeed, there's going to be a little bit about lack of textual encoding in the available resources, and digital mapping to find out and to present the results of our investigations. But first, before we go into the digital methods that I use, a short introduction into the source material. So, Anglo-Saxon charters are one of the main sources of knowledge to my topic, but not the only one. When studying charters, it is very important to use a multidisciplinary approach that would combine textual analysis, paleography, knowledge of archaeology also, and digital methods. There are over 1,600 Anglo-Saxon charters surviving to this day, spanning a period from the beginning of the 7th century till 1066, till 11th century. Not all of them are full documents. Only a proportion of them survives in original form, like the one we can see here on the slide, so an actual diploma. A large proportion of them survives in later copies that have been passed to our time in cartularies compiled in various monasteries in England. Some of them already in 11th century, and some of them are as late in their copies as 13th and beginning of the 14th centuries. It is unfortunately the case that charters get a bit of a bad reputation in historical research as sources that are boring and mostly administrative. But this is not the case. A medieval charter is an extremely interesting source. It's a dynamic source that, apart from recording usually a giving of land or giving of privileges, is also rich in details about the society and the context in which it was given and received. So let us very shortly explore one of them to have a look at what kind of information we can find in a medieval charter. This is Charter Sawyer 535, surviving in its original form. The document is held at British Library and Stowe Charters 26. It's dated to the year 948. This document is very interesting because it's stretched in time. There have been blank spaces left in it to fill in information later. For example, like the information about payment for the land that is being given here. And the payment is £2 of the purest gold, written in a different hand. It's a different scribe filling in at some time later than the original charter was drafted. Same scribe of the later one specifies that the gift was given at Thickham, at this village, because Anglo-Saxon charters are very often bilingual documents that are written not only in Latin, but contain large portions in Old English, which makes them, apart from being important historical documents, makes them also a very important document to the study of Old English language and its dialects. Maybe most important, most interesting part of this charter is the person who is receiving this grant, and this is a religious woman called Elfwin. It's a grant of land being given to a woman. Charters are very important for us to explore the role of women in early medieval societies. We have numerous documents where women feature prominently. This charter, apart from women being part of the transaction, is also witnessed by a queen, Elfifu. Because charters recorded grants and privileges in different geographical locations, which is going to be important for us in a moment, and contained extensive witness lists to preserve their legality, we can, thanks to them, have a view into very different stratas of society. Sometimes in Chartres, even villagers are witnesses, so people who don't get a spotlight in other kinds of written sources. This document tells a story. It's not static, it stretches in time, both in the time of its production and in the time of the events that it records and persons that are being involved. And also, most importantly for us, for our seminar today, it contains those words of Elden Strate, so to the old street. This is, in this case, archaeologically confirmed Roman roads. And we have a number of those in Anglo-Saxon charters. We mostly find them in parts of the document that is called a boundary clause. And what is a boundary clause? Here is a diagram that I use with my students. Boundary clause, it's an element of a charter that usually appears after the main body of the text and before the witness list, that describes the extent of land or the estate that is being given, granted, or bought in the charter. And it uses landmarks in the landscape that would be easily recognizable both for the parties of the charter and for the witnesses that had to confirm it. It usually goes in a clockwise fashion. There are exceptions from it. And as we can see here, it would go from one landmark to another and enumerate them. And as much as might it sound funny, those boundary clauses indeed use terms like the big stone, or the old oak, or the burial mound, or the house of Wulfston, because those would be landmarks that would be easily recognizable for people in the local society. Up to this day, there are in England traditions of the so-called beating the bounds, where members of the local parish on the feast of the local saint would walk the boundaries of the parish with big sticks and beat the land in confirmation, recognition of the borders of their community. So we also know that Anglo-Saxon charters are also documents that record a certain performance, because it is theorized that after the charter has been drafted, after it has been signed by the witnesses, parties of the agreement would actually walk those bounds, would physically walk the border of the estate, both to check its legality, that indeed this is the stretch of land that has been given or purchased or granted, and also in a form of ritual that in tradition has been in some places of England preserved to this day. And we have a number of Roman infrastructural remains in those boundary clauses. Those are mostly roads. There's a number of bridges appearing also, and a very, very small number of milestones that have still survived. So now we have to build our data set from those over 1,600 documents. And it involved, in my case, scraping many existing databases of Anglo-Saxon charters and enriching them manually from the existing editions. This data set, as I said, containing over 1,600 documents, was then imported into R to work on it. So where and how did I obtain the source material? Anglo-Saxon charters are very fortunate because they have been an object of numerous digital humanities projects over the years, stretching back into the 90s. Many of them are still available on the internet, and they are in various stadiums of advancement. The most often used is the so-called electronic Sawyer. Sawyer is the name of the researcher who has compiled the most known catalogue of Anglo-Saxon charters, and the numbers are the so-called Sawyer numbers. So the Anglo-Saxon charters are catalogued according to this. There would be an S and a number coming from Sawyer. There's also the Anglo-Saxon Charters website, the Campbell websites, and the Landscape project. The Landscape project is mostly focused on boundary clauses, so it would be very useful for my research. Unfortunately, those projects are in various states of maintenance, which makes us ask questions of sustainability of digital humanities projects, which I guess is something that worries us all who work in this area, because some of them are no longer maintained. And when we try to use the databases, we just get error messages, or only parts of them work. Electronic Sawyer, the main and most complete database, does not use the text encoding initiative. Texts of the charters, the transcriptions of the charters, are in plain text, which in itself poses a problem to begin with. Because yes, we have the text digitalized, but it is in no way structured. This stood partly behind choosing R as the main language to work with, because of its ease of working with plain text and being able to structure and restructure it in ways that we would need. There are, of course, other ways of doing this. Apart from that, there are multiple other difficulties to our data set. It is inherently, as we've already said, multilingual. So we have both Latin and Old English in very often in the same documents. There are, of course, multiple spelling variants and inconsistent metadata. Those projects, those numerous projects existing, are in most cases not interchangeable with each other. They have mostly been created in isolation. And so apart from gathering the data, there was also the need to standardize it, obviously. This touches on things like, for example, the dates of various charters, the locations of the estates, and the need to, in many cases, manually work.
How do you translate charter in this context?
Excuse me?
How would you say in German, charter?
Urkunde. Urkunde. So this is an Anglo-Saxische Urkunden. To that, I can add that Anglo-Saxon charters are, even though they are the same sort of source like the charters we know from the continent, they have many peculiarities in the way they are structured, which doesn't necessarily reflect as a difficulty with the data set here, but it stands them apart from many continental sets of charters. So after gathering this data, we could move to analyzing the existing data set and to map it, because one of the key research questions that I have given myself was to look into the spatial distribution of those mentions and wanting to look into how they fit into, for example, the network of Roman roads that we have confirmed archaeologically in Britain. before I moved to looking into the charters that contain just the Roman roads, I have moved into, can we see? Yeah, we do. I have, of course, moved into trying to map all of them into the map of Britain, all of them that we can find a location, because out of this data set of over 1,600 documents, some of them contain no information of where the actual estate is located, or the estate has not been correlated with an existing place in Britain. So we, for example, have the name of the village or of the estate in Old English, but we have not managed to find out to which modern place it corresponds. Nevertheless, it was possible to map over 1,200 of them and find places, find corresponding modern locations to them. So the first thing I looked into was the density of gifts, of charters in particular places in Britain. Which regions attracted most of those grants and in which periods of time? Which monarchs were most interested in giving charters in which areas of Anglo-Saxon Britain? We have to keep in mind that this is the question not only of where those grants were given, but it's also a question of survival of those documents, which we should never lose from our minds, because, for example, we have only less than 30 charters from north of the Humber, from northern England, because they've been lost. And that would, of course, skew our statistical or density analysis if we do not keep that in mind. We know they existed. For example, the Venerable Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum mentions that he had access to Northumbrian charters as source material, but they have been mostly lost. We have almost none of early charters from Northumbria. Moreover, which we will talk about later, there's also a question of authenticity of those documents and the scholarly approach and scholarly consensus of authenticity of many of those documents. So if we look at the distribution of grants that we have by county in England, it looks here that most of the ones that we have are from Kent, so south-eastern England, which would not surprise us because Kent is the place from which we have the oldest charters in Britain, from the 7th century. It's also a region under substantial influence from the Frankish kingdoms, from the Merovingian kingdoms. One of the theories posits that charter was reintroduced to England through the influence of the Merovingians as a document, and from their spread as a method of confirming grants of land throughout England. But if we look at the actual point density of those grants, we can see that most dense areas are the ones in the west of England, near the border with modern Wales. And here we had our first discovery, because it's been posited already in 1980s and beginning of the 90s by De la Hougue that this region, because of possible high continuity from Roman times and extremely rich villa landscape, would be the region where we would find most charters, and we would find the most active landscape of grants and change, and that this would be an area and a region where charters would easily be adopted. And indeed, this is the place where we find most of those documents. But this density is obviously not static in time, and if we look at this distribution throughout centuries, we can see that it changes. And the focal points of the surviving documents that we have fluctuate throughout the region from where we have a surviving data set. The West keeps being an important focal point, but for example, in the 7th and the 9th centuries, it is indeed Kent which attracts most of those grants. Let's then look at specifically the Roman roads in Chartres, and why are they a fascinating topic. So we have around 100 of charters out of those 1600 that mention Roman roads. Their distribution chronologically is not static and differs widely, and there's a number of reasons for them. So there's a spike in those mentions in the 10th century, and already it goes on the rise in the 9th. It might be connected with an increased usage of increased reuse of Roman roads in the Burg infrastructural project that starts under King Alfred, which is connected with the defense against the Vikings in the second half of the 9th century. But it might also be correlated with the increasing confidence of Anglo Saxon state and the fact that they could bring more of those roads into active use. And here we touch a problem of, if those roads are mentioned in charters, in boundary clauses, does that mean that they are actually in use? Or are they just, so to speak, dead elements of the landscape that are easily recognizable? Most of them are made of stone. They would have been overgrown, and most of them would run in straight lines, so they would be very handy demarcation elements. And indeed, in the scholarship for a long time, it has been assumed that this must be the case. But if we look at the phrases that are actually used in the charters, there is a number of them that are that occur only once, but there are also cases of information of what state the actual road is. For example, we have mentions of broken streets, from which we could assume that the drafters of the charters at least had some interest into what state of maintenance the road was in. A vast majority of phrases used for Roman roads in the charters are various iterations of the Old English word stret, coming from Latin strata via and being adopted in Old English. This is also, the dataset also looks that way because a large proportion of bounds are in Old English. This comes back to the fact that the bounds had to be recognizable for the local community and understandable for the witnesses and the parties of the charter. And as not all witnesses were people who would necessarily know Latin, because we know there were also villagers there, then an increasing number of those bounds, the later chronologically, the more is in Old English. We also have elements preserving what we could assume at least some knowledge of Latin legal status of those roads. We can only hypothesize, is this a matter of continuity or is this a matter of reintroduction? Like, for example, via publica, which we also find in other regions of post-Roman West. So if we look at the distribution of those charters that have Roman roads in them, we have large clusters of them in Kent, again because of the number of charters that are there, but also possibly because of the survivability of the Roman landscape there and the ability of the local polities to use that Roman infrastructure as a governance resource. And we have also a number of them in Western England with corridors between them. And this validates, for example, the archaeological hypothesis of Sue Harrington and Martin Welch, who in the work on the Southern English kingdoms from the 5th to the 7th centuries posited a continuous usage of Roman roads in the east-west corridor for various economical activities, like, for example, transhumance. And indeed, there is, one can see when looking at the map that this corridor is visible, and there's also corridors visible to important para-urban centers. So like this line of 4 charters leading south from the main corridor towards the Isle of Wight. This leads to Winchester. This is a Roman road leading to Winchester. Now, if we put those on the map of archaeologically known Roman roads in England, most of them correlate with those quite well. There are a couple of those where archaeologically a road hasn't been confirmed, but has been supposed. And in many of those places, I could posit that have a charter which uses a term that is usually used for a Roman road in those charters. In most of those places, probably we would archaeologically find that road if we looked for it. Now, maps are nice. Static maps are also nice. They look nice in publications, but why not go interactive with this kind of data and this kind of information? And R offers us a very nice possibility to do this. So as part of the project, I have built an interactive atlas of those mentions, which incorporates all of them on a map of known, even very small tracks from the Roman times, and allows the user to explore those mentions, both chronologically and through the phrases that are being used to describe those charters. So that way we can, for example, see that if we go early, we can clearly see that corridor that's been mentioned in the work on Southern Kingdoms from the 5th to the 7th centuries, and we see that there is an interest of granting estates along this corridor. If we go to the later period, spanning 10th and 11th centuries, we see this great interest in the West, but also the increasing central England and a bit in the north. Central England being much more visible in those grants close to the border with what was under Viking occupation. We can also explore different phrases that are being used, in this case in original orthography. So for the purposes of statistical analysis, I have, of course, standardized the orthography, but it's also interesting, might be interesting for the user to look for particular terms that are being used and in which part of England we can find them. So this interactive atlas is also an important part of my project. But it is not only roads that we can find in those charters from the Roman past. We can also learn about cities, about the continuous importance which lurks hidden in those documents. But for that, we have to leave the boundary clauses and look closer at witness lists and places where the charters were enacted. So this is S1266, also had in the British Library, and we can see here a phrase in Keyvittatus de Rubenia, which uses the term Keyvittatus. And we know that there are narrative sources that in the British context, in the Anglo-Saxon context, use the term Keyvittatus with striking ability to preserve the knowledge of which urban centers indeed were Keyvittatus in the Roman times. This has been already researched, for example, for Bede by Campbell, who has proven that he's almost perfect in that, and therefore I decided to check whether the scribes and drafters of Anglo-Saxon charters also managed to distinguish those places and use the correct terminology for them. So indeed, when we look at the mentions of Keyvittatus in Anglo-Saxon charters, most of them are correct. There are three glaring exceptions that occur only in singular documents, that is Crickdale, Chartres, and Shaftesbury. All three of them are in some kind connected with Roman past, but there were absolutely no Keyvittatus in that place. Shaftesbury is perhaps there because it had a monastic foundation. Chartres and Crickdale have Roman roads there, but we can only speculate why this mistake was made. But it seems that the use of the term Keyvittatus went beyond bare memory of whether this place was Keyvittatus in Roman times or not, and had also practical repercussions. So if we look at the distribution, which places get most often described as Keyvittatus, we get a slightly different picture. All the regions raised to prominence, this time northwest. The art of mention is different. No longer we deal here with a representation of the landscape. So we are not looking for recognizable landmarks or existing features, but more we deal here with geographies of power. It matters in those documents who has the right to the Roman past and who can use it. Roman memory here reflects on early medieval politics. So, for example, we have so few charters from the north, but the number of charters throughout England is witnessed by Archbishop of York, and he very much likes to use the term that he's a bishop of a Keyvittatus. That's why York features very high in that list. And we might suppose that it might have something to do with the conflicts with Canterbury, the main archbishopric with England, and who had the right to the Roman past. The third place is Winchester, the royal residence, the seat of power, the political node, where it would be beneficial to preserve information about Roman past. So this analysis of those mentions confirms existing geographies of power in Anglo-Saxon England. There is a question of authenticity of those documents. So as I mentioned at the beginning, many of them survive to our times not in original documents, but in copies that are gathered in collections and cartularies, done sometimes much later. And this has, of course, repercussions to how we can approach this data set. So among those documents which mention Roman roads, overwhelming proportion is deemed authentic by scholars. A smaller percentage of them is disputed, and a very small number, but still is considered spurious, is considered forged. Part of the problem here is that if you falsify a charter which grants land and you give an estate there, obviously you have absolutely no interest for the boundary clause which describes the borders of this estate to be not recognized. My opinion, redeems the spurious charters for our analysis, because we're looking for particular landmarks in the landscape. And even if the charter is forged much later, this of course is important for the chronological analysis, but does not invalidate that document for our research. Because even when it is forged, it still had to reflect the piece of land that somebody was after. And I would like to, this problem of authenticity, this problem of historiographical metadata, so to speak. The more I worked on this data set, the more it interested me. Because there's a wide range of opinions about those documents. There are scholars who tend to dismiss many documents, being very strict in assessing their authenticity. And there are scholars who like to look for even traces that could redeem a charter and make it authentic. But if we look at the distribution, we can't really well see the names of the archives, but I'll describe it under the light. So this is a matrix of charters arranged chronologically from down to up, by archive where they are held. And I decided to use this historiographical metadata and aggregate it and have a look at whether the sentiments towards, whether the confidence towards a particular set of documents being held under a particular archive is maybe in any way dependent on where we can find them or how much they were studied. And here we have 12 archives that contain charters from every century. So we have some of the main ones like Canterbury, Worcester, and some of the minor ones like Chartres. And sadly, we cannot see the labels, my bad, under this. But if we look at large archives like Canterbury or Worcester that have been widely researched by scholars, they on average will be quite disputed. They will be in the greens, like the one on the left and the one on the very right, because there would be a lot of scholars having various opinions of them. If we look at smaller archives that are prominent, like Rochester, they will tend to greater trust. They would be more in the yellows. But if we look at small archives that were studied in passing or considered to be, or were prejudiced towards as being mostly copied, they will be deemed untrustworthy, be mostly in dark blues and purples, like Chartres, the third one here. This is why, even though this is a digital humanities project, and even though this is a project which works on aggregating data, on working with large amount of text. It is always important to keep in mind that each of those documents has to be also assessed individually. And each of these documents has to be, we have to look into the historiographical metadata on each of those documents, on how they were seen in the past scholarship and how they were seen in various studies that touched on them. I think that there is a very interesting research paper in historiographical metadata into looking at into a digital humanities project in historiography of the sources. I have done this in a very small extent in this case, but I think it's an avenue definitely worth pursuing. To conclude, this project has been very interesting for me as a digital humanist, but also as a historian. It has given me a lot of material for my book on uses of Roman past in Anglo Saxon England. And charters are a very, if I may say so, nice kind of source for digital humanities. They are easy to catalogue. They are often formulaic, so they're easily analyzed in many places. They span a large, as a collection, it spans a very large time period, which allows us to look in a big perspective onto the problem. They're also short as text mostly, which also makes it easier. But at the same time, because they're multilingual, because there's the problem of authenticity, they pose their own problems and their own challenges. But I sure hope that not only Anglo-Saxon charters will be analyzed in that way. I think there is a lot of material here which would hopefully be my next project, to look for Roman past in continental charters, which are even larger data sets, spanning even larger time periods, which is going to definitely help with comparison. So, thank you very much, and I invite everybody to questions.